Hello guys, in tonight's mystery we present the truth about the Dyatlov Pass incident. 9 experienced hikers vanished in the snowy Ural Mountains, their bodies later found in disturbing conditions that have baffled experts for decades. It's one of those stories that leaves more questions than answers, and tonight you'll hear it all. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. Now, lie back, listen closely and drift off as the mystery unfolds. The telephone rang at 3:47 a.m. in the cramped office of the Sverdlovsk Search and Rescue Headquarters. Captain Mikhail Potapov had been expecting this call for 3 days, though he'd hoped it would never come. The voice on the other end belonged to Yuri Blinov, university administrator and father figure to the missing expedition group. They should have sent word by now. Blinov's voice carried the particular strain of someone who'd been awake for days. The telegram was supposed to arrive yesterday at the latest. Potapov knew the statistics. In the Ural Mountains, when experienced hikers missed their check-in by more than 24 hours during winter, the survival rate dropped to numbers no one spoke aloud. But these weren't ordinary hikers. Igor Dyatlov's group represented the finest outdoor enthusiasts the Ural Polytechnic Institute had produced. 9 students and 1 graduate, all seasoned mountaineers with collective decades of winter experience. The expedition had departed on January 23, 1959, bound for Otorten Mountain. Their planned route would take them through some of the most unforgiving terrain in the northern Urals, but for this group it represented an achievable challenge rather than a death wish. They'd meticulously planned every detail, from food rations calculated to the gram, to backup equipment stored in waterproof containers. As Potapov assembled his search team, he reviewed the expedition's roster. Igor Dyatlov, 23, the group's leader and an engineering student whose previous expeditions had become legendary among his peers. Zinaida Kolmogorova, 22, one of the few women brave enough to attempt winter mountaineering in an era when such pursuits were considered masculine domains. Alexander Kolovatov, 24, a meteorology student whose understanding of weather patterns had saved multiple expeditions from disaster. The list continued with names that would soon become etched in mystery. Yuri Doroshenko, Georgy Krivonishenko, Yuri Yudin, Rustem Slobodin, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, and Lyudmila Dubinina. Each possessed specialized skills that made them invaluable team members. Yudin, however, had turned back early due to illness, a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. When the search party finally reached the abandoned truck that had transported the group to their starting point, they found it exactly as expected, properly secured, with extra supplies stored inside. The real investigation began when they discovered the tent on the slopes of Kholat Shachel, a mountain whose Mansi name translated to Dead Mountain. The scene defied every principle of wilderness survival Potapov had learned in his 15 years of mountain rescue. The tent had been cut open from the inside, not torn by wind or damaged by external forces. The cuts were deliberate and methodical, made by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Yet the pattern made no sense. Why would experienced mountaineers destroy their only shelter during a blizzard? More disturbing were the footprints leading away from the tent. 9 sets of tracks, some barefoot, others in socks or single boots, headed down the slope toward the tree line. These weren't the panicked, scattered tracks of people fleeing in terror. They moved in a roughly organized formation, suggesting the group had evacuated together with some degree of coordination. The temperature that night had plummeted to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Even with proper cold weather gear, survival time in such conditions is measured in minutes, not hours. Yet the footprints indicated the group had walked nearly a mile from their shelter, down an exposed slope that offered no protection from the wind. As the search team followed the tracks, they discovered something that would become one of the incident's most puzzling aspects: personal belongings scattered along the route. The personal belongings were not dropped randomly, but were placed with apparent deliberation. Someone had left a flashlight on, and it was still in working order. Despite the apparent urgency of the situation, a piece of clothing lay there, folded. The first bodies were found near the tree line, beneath a large cedar tree. Yuri Doroshenko and Georgy Krivonishenko lay side by side, dressed only in underwear despite the deadly cold. Their hands showed signs of desperate climbing attempts on the cedar's trunk, with bark embedded under their fingernails and skin scraped raw. Someone had built a fire nearby, evidenced by the charred branches and ash circle, but it had been insufficient to sustain life in such extreme conditions. The scene suggested a group that had fled their shelter in extreme haste, yet had somehow maintained enough composure to attempt survival strategies. This contradiction would become the foundation of countless theories, each attempting to explain how rational, experienced mountaineers could make such seemingly irrational decisions. 3 more bodies were discovered along the route back toward the tent, as if they had attempted to return to their shelter, but succumbed to the cold. Igor Dyatlov himself was found 300 meters from the cedar tree, his body positioned as though he had been crawling uphill. Zinaida Kolmogorova was found further along, and Rustem Slobodin was closest to the tent, just 480 meters from their abandoned shelter. Exposure and hypothermia could potentially explain these 5 tragic deaths. The true mystery pertained to the remaining 4 team members, whose bodies remained undiscovered for an additional 2 months. When they were finally discovered in a snow-covered ravine, the investigation would take a turn that transformed a wilderness tragedy into one of the most enduring mysteries of the modern era. The spring thaw of 1959 arrived later than usual in the northern Urals, extending the search for the remaining 4 expedition members well into May. Search teams had combed every likely location, following protocols developed over decades of mountain rescue operations, yet the bodies of Alexander Kolevatov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, Lyudmila Dubinina, and Yuri Yudin seemed to have vanished into the mountain itself. Senior investigator Lev Ivanov had taken personal charge of the case, recognizing that the incident had implications far beyond a simple mountaineering accident. The Soviet system demanded explanations, particularly when 9 of the country's brightest young minds had died under mysterious circumstances. The families deserved answers, and the mountaineering community needed to understand what had gone wrong to prevent future tragedies. The breakthrough came on May 4th, when a search team discovered a section of snow that had settled differently than the surrounding area. Beneath this depression, they found what appeared to be a makeshift shelter. Branches and clothing, arranged in a pattern that suggested the missing 4 had survived the initial evacuation from their tent and had attempted to create a more permanent refuge. But when the bodies were finally excavated, the mystery deepened exponentially. These 4 individuals had not died from exposure like their companions. They had suffered massive internal injuries that defied explanation. Thibault-Brignol's skull had been fractured with such force that brain tissue had been displaced. Dubinina's ribs were broken, and her heart had been crushed. Kolevatov showed similar internal damage, as if all 3 had been subjected to tremendous pressure from an external force. The medical examiner's report would become one of the most controversial documents in Soviet investigative history. Dr. Boris Vozrojdeny, a pathologist with 30 years of experience, stated that the injuries were consistent with massive trauma, as if they had been hit by a car or caught in a shockwave. Yet there were no external wounds, no cuts or bruises that would typically accompany such severe internal damage. Most disturbing of all was the condition of Lyudmila Dubinina's body. Her tongue and eyes were missing, along with significant portions of soft tissue around her face. Initially attributed to natural decomposition and animal activity, the pattern of tissue loss troubled investigators. The damage appeared too selective, too precise for scavenging animals, who typically follow predictable feeding patterns. The clothing analysis provided additional puzzles. Several garments showed elevated levels of radioactivity, detected by instruments that Soviet authorities rarely deployed for wilderness investigations. The contamination wasn't uniform. It appeared concentrated on specific pieces of clothing, as if the individuals had been exposed to a radioactive source during their final hours. Yuri Yudin, the expedition member who had turned back due to illness, would spend the rest of his life studying photographs and evidence from the scene. In later interviews, he noted details that official reports had overlooked. The tent's damage pattern, he insisted, showed 2 distinct types of cuts, some made hastily from inside by people in extreme distress, others made with more precision, possibly by someone with access to better tools. The footprint analysis revealed another troubling detail. While 9 sets of tracks led away from the tent, the pattern wasn't consistent with a panicked evacuation. The spacing between footprints suggested a walking pace, not running. Some tracks showed evidence of individuals stopping, turning around, and continuing in the same direction. This behavior pattern didn't match any known psychological response to immediate danger. Local Mountsy hunters, when finally interviewed, provided information that investigators initially dismissed but would later consider crucial. They reported unusual lights in the sky during the time period when the expedition would have been setting up camp. These weren't aurora borealis, which were common in the region, but focused moving lights that appeared to originate from a specific location, rather than the broad atmospheric displays typical of natural phenomena. The Mountsy also mentioned finding animal tracks that stopped abruptly in the snow, as if wildlife had fled the area suddenly. This detail gained significance when investigators realized that the search teams had found no animal remains or tracks in the immediate vicinity of the tent, unusual for an area that typically supported diverse winter wildlife. As the investigation progressed, Ivanov began documenting details that weren't making their way into official reports. Military personnel had been present during several phases of the search, offering technical assistance that seemed to focus more on removing evidence than preserving it. Certain photographs had been confiscated, and witnesses had been advised to limit their discussions of what they had observed. The tent itself had been removed from the scene and transported to a secure facility, where it remained for examination by specialists whose credentials were never disclosed. When it was finally returned to the investigation, several pieces of fabric had been removed for testing purposes. These samples were never mentioned in subsequent reports, and requests for their return or analysis results were met with administrative delays. The most troubling aspect of the evidence chain was the gap between the discovery of the first 5 bodies and the location of the remaining 4. 2 months had passed, during which the investigation had supposedly been thorough and comprehensive. Yet the 4 bodies in the ravine had been located in an area that search teams claimed to have examined multiple times. Either the initial searches had been remarkably incompetent, or the bodies had been placed in the ravine after the area had been cleared. The official cause of death for the ravine victims was listed as compelling natural force, a phrase that satisfied no one and explained nothing. This bureaucratic language would become emblematic of the entire investigation, technically accurate but deliberately vague, creating more questions than answers. As summer approached and the case moved toward official closure, Ivanov found himself under increasing pressure to produce a conclusion that would satisfy his superiors while providing closure to the families. The solution he would ultimately propose would be both groundbreaking and career-ending, representing one of the most unusual official explanations in Soviet investigative history. Lev Ivanov had built his reputation on methodical investigation and logical conclusions. In 23 years of criminal investigation, he'd never encountered evidence that refused to conform to rational explanation. The Dyatlov Pass incident was reshaping his understanding of what constituted acceptable evidence and reasonable doubt. The pressure from his superiors intensified as summer progressed. The families of the deceased had become increasingly vocal in their demands for answers. The international mountaineering community had begun asking questions that Moscow preferred not to address. Most significantly, the incident had attracted attention from foreign journalists, who were beginning to inquire about Soviet wilderness safety protocols. Decades later, Ivanov's private notes surfaced, revealing the depth of his frustration. He documented numerous anomalies that contradicted the official narrative of a mountaineering accident. The radiation readings, the unusual injury patterns, the selective tissue damage, the military presence during the investigation. Each element suggested a complex incident that extended far beyond equipment failure or weather-related deaths. The breakthrough in his thinking came during a conversation with Dr. Vozrojdeny, the pathologist who'd examined the ravine victims. Over vodka in the doctor's kitchen, away from official recording devices, Vozrojdeny shared observations that hadn't appeared in his written reports. He explained that the damage to the rib cage was not consistent with falling or hitting rocks. The fracture patterns indicated a simultaneous application of uniform pressure throughout the entire chest cavity. I've seen similar injuries in aircraft accident victims, but only when they've been subjected to extreme changes in air pressure. Vozrozhdeny continued with even more disturbing details. Neither animals nor decomposition had removed the missing soft tissues from Dubinina's face. The edges of the damage were too clean, too precise. Something had selectively removed specific tissues while leaving others intact. In 30 years of pathology, he said, I've never seen animal predation that targets only the mouth and eye area, while leaving more accessible tissue untouched. Whatever removed those tissues had a specific purpose. In the meantime, Ivanov was receiving reports from the search teams, which were not part of the official documentation. During the rescue operation, multiple witnesses reported observing unusual aerial phenomena. These weren't casual glimpses of distant objects, but prolonged observations of structured lights that moved in patterns inconsistent with natural phenomena or known aircraft. Sergeant Vladimir Ashkenazy, who'd led several search teams, provided the most detailed account. On the night of February 17th, while searching for the remaining 4 bodies, his team had observed a bright orange sphere moving slowly across the sky. The object had maintained a consistent altitude and speed for approximately 15 minutes before suddenly accelerating and disappearing beyond the horizon. It wasn't a flare or aircraft navigation light, Ashkenazy insisted. The colour was unlike anything in our standard equipment inventory, and the movement pattern was too controlled to be natural phenomena. Other team members corroborated similar observations on different nights. The consistency of these reports troubled Ivanov, particularly when combined with the Mansi hunters' accounts of unusual lights in the area during the time when the expedition would have been active. The military's involvement in the investigation had become increasingly intrusive. Colonel Georgy Ortyukov, ostensibly present to provide logistical support, had begun directing certain aspects of the evidence collection. Specific items were being removed from the scene for specialized analysis at facilities that Ivanov couldn't identify or access. Upon Ivanov's request for information about these analyses, he received a response that classified such details for national security reasons. This response transformed his investigation from a criminal case into something approaching a state secret, with implications that extended far beyond the deaths of 9 mountaineers. The final setback occurred when Ivanov received instructions to prepare his closing report without access to several crucial pieces of evidence: the tent fabric samples, the clothing with elevated radiation readings, and the photographs showing the unusual light phenomena had all been classified and removed from his case files. Faced with an impossible situation, Ivanov made a decision that would define the remainder of his career. He would include in his official report a conclusion that acknowledged the evidence while avoiding details that might compromise state security. His solution was both brilliant and professionally suicidal. Ivanov, in his final report, attributed the deaths to a compelling natural force that the investigation was unable to definitively identify. He specifically noted the presence of unusual phenomena in the area during the relevant time, including light anomalies that had been observed by multiple witnesses. Most significantly, he recommended that the area be designated as off-limits for expeditions for the next 3 years, citing factors beyond current understanding that posed risks to civilian safety. This recommendation would effectively acknowledge that the entity responsible for the deaths of the Dyatlov group might still be active in the region. The reaction to Ivanov's report was swift and severe. He was immediately removed from the case and reassigned to administrative duties. His recommendation for area closure was implemented without public explanation, fueling speculation that would persist for decades. In private conversations with colleagues, Ivanov would later admit that his investigation had uncovered evidence of phenomena that challenged conventional understanding of atmospheric and physical sciences. He'd documented cases where natural laws appeared to have been suspended or altered, creating conditions that could explain the expedition's bizarre behavior and the unusual injuries suffered by the ravine victims. The price of his intellectual honesty was professional isolation. For the remainder of his career, Ivanov would be assigned to cases that posed no threat to state security or established scientific doctrine. He'd successfully solved the Dyatlov Pass mystery, but the solution was too disturbing for official acknowledgement. As the case files were sealed and classified, Ivanov began keeping personal records of his investigation. These documents, hidden in his home for 30 years, would eventually provide the foundation for understanding what had really happened on that February night in the Ural Mountains. The official investigation may have concluded, but the witnesses to the Dyatlov Pass incident couldn't simply return to their previous lives. The search team members, medical personnel, and local residents who'd participated in the rescue operation carried with them memories of phenomena that defied rational explanation. Mikhail Sharavin, the student who'd discovered the tent, would spend decades trying to reconcile what he'd observed with the official narrative. His initial report included details that the case file later removed. The tent's interior had been photographed, showing personal belongings arranged in patterns that suggested the occupants had been engaged in routine activities when something had caused their sudden evacuation. Their boots were lined up as if they'd planned to put them on, Sharavin recalled in later interviews. Food was still warm in containers, and someone had been writing in a journal. The last entry was dated February 1st, but the handwriting changed mid-sentence, as if the writer had been interrupted or had suddenly become agitated. The journal entry itself had been confiscated early in the investigation, but several witnesses had read it before its removal. The final words, written in increasingly erratic handwriting, mentioned the light and "they're watching us." These phrases had been dismissed as hypothermia-induced confusion, but they aligned with similar references found in other expedition members' personal effects. Boris Slobtsov, another search team member, had been present during the discovery of the first bodies near the cedar tree. His account included details that never appeared in official reports, particularly regarding the condition of the tree itself. The cedar tree showed damage that wasn't consistent with climbing attempts, he explained. The bark had been scraped away in long, parallel gouges that started about 4 meters up the trunk. The pattern was too regular to be made by fingernails or improvised tools. Something with considerable strength had marked that tree. More disturbing were Slobtsov's observations about the area around the bodies. The snow had been disturbed in a circular pattern extending approximately 20 meters from the cedar tree. The snow within this circle appeared densely packed, seemingly compressed by immense pressure. Outside the circle, the snow remained in its natural state, creating a distinct boundary that suggested some form of localized atmospheric event. The medical personnel who'd examined the bodies at the scene provided additional testimony that contradicted official reports. Dr. Prudkov, who'd conducted the initial examination of the first 5 bodies, noted that the victim's skin had an unusual orange-brown discoloration that he'd never encountered in typical hypothermia cases. The coloration was most pronounced on exposed skin surfaces, he reported. It wasn't consistent with frostbite or typical cold weather injuries. The pattern suggested exposure to some form of radiation or chemical agent. More significantly, Dr. Prudkov had observed that the victim's clothing showed signs of exposure to intense heat, despite the sub-zero temperatures. The small fire near the cedar tree couldn't explain the scorching patterns on natural fibres, nor had it partially melted synthetic materials. The local Mansi population provided testimonies that investigators initially dismissed, but would later consider crucial. Elder Anyamov Pashi had been hunting in the area during the time when the expedition would have been active. His account included details that aligned with the physical evidence, but challenged conventional understanding of the incident. The reindeer fled the area 3 days before the Russians arrived, he explained through an interpreter. They moved in a group, all at once, as if driven by something they could sense but we couldn't. The hunting was poor for weeks afterward, as if the wildlife had been frightened away from the entire region. During the period when the expedition would have been setting up camp, Pashi also described observing unusual lights in the sky. These weren't aurora displays, which were common in the region, but focused beams that appeared to originate from specific locations, rather than the broad atmospheric phenomena typical of natural light displays. The lights moved with purpose, he recalled. They would appear in one location, remain stationary for several minutes, then move rapidly to another position. This practice continued for several hours across 3 different nights. The military personnel who'd been present during the investigation provided the most restricted testimonies. Security oaths bound most of them, preventing them from discussing their observations, but several made unofficial statements that would remain undocumented for decades. Colonel Ortyukov, who'd overseen the military's involvement in the investigation, would later admit that his teams had been equipped with radiation detection equipment, unusual for a standard search and rescue operation. This equipment had registered elevated readings at multiple locations around the incident site, including areas where the expedition members had never been known to travel. The radiation signatures were inconsistent with any known natural sources in the region, he explained in a classified debrief. The pattern suggested contamination from an artificial source, but we couldn't identify the origin or determine how the expedition members had been exposed. The most significant testimony came from Captain Chernyshev, who'd been responsible for processing the physical evidence. His account included details about items that had been removed from the official inventory and sent to specialized facilities for analysis. He reported that several pieces of clothing displayed damage patterns that defied environmental explanations. The fabric had been altered at a molecular level, as if exposed to energies that we couldn't identify using standard testing protocols. Chernyshev also documented the discovery of metallic fragments near the tent site that weren't consistent with the expedition's equipment inventory. These fragments had been immediately classified and removed from the scene, but not before several witnesses had observed their unusual properties. The metal didn't match any known alloys in our reference database, he explained. It showed characteristics that our metallurgists couldn't explain, including resistance to standard chemical testing and unusual magnetic properties. The witness testimonies created a comprehensive picture of an incident that extended far beyond the official narrative of a mountaineering accident. The consistency of these accounts, despite the witnesses' diverse backgrounds and lack of communication with each other, suggested that something extraordinary had occurred in the Ural Mountains that February night. As the years passed and the official secrecy surrounding the case began to relax, these testimonies would provide the foundation for understanding the true nature of the Dyatlov Pass incident. The witnesses had observed phenomena that challenged conventional understanding of physical laws, atmospheric science, and human physiology. The Soviet military's involvement in the Dyatlov Pass investigation extended far beyond the logistical support officially acknowledged. Declassified documents from the 1990s revealed that the incident had triggered a response protocol typically reserved for national security threats, involving specialized units whose existence hadn't been publicly acknowledged. Colonel Georgy Ortyukov's assignment to the search operation had been personally approved by the Ministry of Defense, unusual for what was supposedly a civilian mountaineering accident. Expertise in atmospheric phenomena and unconventional weapons systems, seemingly irrelevant to wilderness rescue operations, was part of his background. A series of reports from radar installations in the Ural region had triggered the military's interest in the case. During the night of February 1st to 2nd, operators at the Alapayevsk monitoring station had detected aerial objects moving at speeds and altitudes that didn't match any known aircraft configurations. These contacts had appeared suddenly, maintained impossible flight patterns, and disappeared from radar without following conventional aircraft departure procedures. Captain Alexei Maslenikov, who'd served as the official liaison between the military and civilian investigation teams, would later reveal that the radar contacts had been classified at the highest levels. The objects had demonstrated flight characteristics that exceeded the capabilities of any known aircraft, including experimental designs being developed in the Soviet Union's most advanced research facilities. The radar signatures were unlike anything in our identification database, Maslenikov explained in a 1991 interview. The objects moved in patterns that violated our understanding of aerodynamics and propulsion systems. They could hover motionless for extended periods, then accelerate to supersonic speeds without any apparent transition phase. The military's response to these radar contacts had been swift and comprehensive. Fighter aircraft had been dispatched from the Plesetsk air base, but pilots had been unable to visually acquire the targets despite clear radar confirmation of their presence. This combination of radar detection and visual absence suggested technologies that challenged fundamental assumptions about stealth and detection systems. More disturbing were the reports from the fighter pilots themselves. Squadron leader Anatoly Bartolomei had attempted to intercept one of the radar contacts during the early morning hours of February 2nd. His aircraft had been vectored to the target location, but instead of encountering a conventional aircraft, he'd observed a luminous object that had appeared to respond to his approach. The object was approximately circular and emitted a bright orange glow, Bartolome reported. It maintained a constant altitude while my aircraft approached, then suddenly accelerated vertically at a rate that should have been impossible for any aircraft. The acceleration forces alone would have killed any human crew. The pilot's gun camera had recorded the encounter, but the footage was immediately classified and removed from his aircraft systems. Bartolome would never see the recording again, and his subsequent attempts to discuss the incident were met with official discouragement and reassignment to administrative duties. The military's investigation had identified additional incidents in the region that preceded the Dyatlov expedition by several months. Local residents had reported unusual aerial phenomena throughout the winter of 1958 to 1959, including lights that moved in organized formations and objects that appeared to land in remote areas before departing without a trace. Military intelligence units collected these reports and classified them as potentially related to foreign surveillance operations. The possibility of unknown aircraft operating in Soviet airspace sparked a comprehensive investigation involving multiple intelligence agencies and specialized technical units. The discovery of the Dyatlov expedition's fate had occurred within this context of heightened military alertness. The initial assumption had been that the mountaineers had witnessed classified operations or had been victims of equipment testing that had gone wrong. This theory had shaped the early phases of the investigation, with military personnel focusing on evidence recovery rather than rescue operations. The radiation readings detected on the victims' clothing had been particularly significant to military investigators. The contamination patterns were consistent with exposure to specific isotopes that weren't naturally occurring in the region. This suggested that the expedition members had encountered materials or weapon systems that involved radioactive components. Dr. Lev Tumanov, a nuclear physicist who'd been consulting the military investigation, had analyzed the contamination patterns and concluded that they were consistent with exposure to weapons-grade materials. However, the isotopes detected didn't match any known Soviet weapons systems, raising the possibility that the expedition had encountered foreign technology. The radiation signature was distinctive enough to identify its source, Tumanov explained in a classified report. But the source wasn't in our weapons inventory or any known foreign systems. The isotopes suggested technologies that were either extremely advanced or completely unknown to our scientific community. The military's involvement in the case had extended to the examination of the physical evidence, with specialized teams conducting analyses that weren't available to civilian investigators. These examinations had revealed anomalies that challenged conventional understanding of materials science and atmospheric physics. The tent fabric had been subjected to spectrographic analysis that revealed molecular changes consistent with exposure to intense electromagnetic fields. The synthetic materials had been altered at a structural level, creating properties that couldn't be replicated using known manufacturing processes. More significantly, the metallic fragments discovered near the tent site had been analyzed using techniques typically reserved for foreign weapon systems. The fragments showed characteristics that didn't match any known alloys, including unusual magnetic properties and resistance to conventional chemical testing. The military's conclusion had been that the Dyatlov expedition had encountered phenomena that were beyond current technological understanding. Whether these phenomena represented foreign weapons systems, natural events, or something else entirely remained classified, but the military had determined that the incident posed potential threats to national security. This assessment had led to the classification of the entire investigation and the implementation of security protocols that would remain in effect for decades. The military's involvement in the case had transformed it from a wilderness tragedy into a state secret, with implications that extended far beyond the deaths of 9 mountaineers. By the late 1980s, the Soviet system's grip on information was beginning to weaken. Former investigators, witnesses, and officials had opportunities to share decades-old suppressed information thanks to glasnost policies. The Dyatlov Pass incident, buried under layers of classification and bureaucratic denial, began to resurface in unexpected ways. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. Yuri Yudin, the expedition member who'd turned back due to illness, had spent 30 years quietly collecting information about his friends' deaths. Due to his unique position as both an insider and an outsider to the incident, he was able to maintain relationships with investigators, witnesses and officials who might have otherwise remained silent. Yudin's private investigation had uncovered a network of evidence that painted a picture far more complex than the official narrative. Through careful cultivation of sources and patient document collection, he'd assembled a comprehensive record of the incident that included classified materials, witness testimonies, and technical analyses that had never been made public. In 1988, Yudin made the most significant breakthrough by gaining access to Lev Ivanov's personal files. The former chief investigator, now retired and suffering from terminal cancer, had decided to share his documentation with someone who could ensure the truth would eventually emerge. The official investigation had excluded photographs, witness statements, and technical reports from Ivanov's private files. The most shocking revelation was the extent of the military's involvement and the sophisticated nature of the observed phenomena. The investigation was compromised from the beginning, Ivanov explained to Yudin during their final meeting. We were investigating a mystery while the military was conducting a cover-up. The evidence pointed to events that challenged our understanding of physics and atmospheric science, but reporting such conclusions would have ended careers and possibly lives. The files revealed that the military had been tracking unusual aerial phenomena in the region for months before the expedition's departure. The radar contacts, pilot encounters, and witness testimonies had created a comprehensive picture of ongoing activities that involved technologies beyond conventional understanding. The medical files, classified and removed from the official investigation, were even more disturbing. Dr. Vozrozhdeni's comprehensive autopsy reports revealed previously undisclosed details about the victims' injuries. The internal trauma suffered by the ravine victims was even more severe than initially reported, with tissue damage that suggested exposure to forces that couldn't be explained by conventional weapons or environmental factors. The radiation analysis had revealed contamination patterns that were consistent with exposure to exotic materials. The isotopes detected weren't naturally occurring and didn't match any known Soviet weapon systems. This suggested that the expedition had encountered technologies that were either extremely advanced or completely unknown to contemporary science. Yudin's investigation had also uncovered evidence of a systematic effort to suppress information about the incident. Witnesses had been reassigned, transferred, or discouraged from discussing their observations. Physical evidence had been classified and removed from civilian access. Even family members had been advised to limit their inquiries about the investigation's findings. The most significant cover-up involved the destruction of evidence that might have provided definitive answers about the incident's cause. The tent fabric samples that had shown molecular alterations were destroyed in a laboratory accident in 1962. The metallic fragments discovered near the tent site were lost during a routine transfer between facilities. The gun camera footage from the fighter pilot's encounter was declared damaged beyond recovery, after being stored in a secure facility for less than a year. These convenient losses suggested a deliberate effort to eliminate evidence that might have revealed the true nature of the phenomena involved in the incident. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental, indicating high-level coordination to suppress information that was considered threatening to state security. The international implications of the cover-up were revealed through Yudin's contacts with foreign researchers who had been monitoring the incident. The unusual nature of the deaths and the Soviet government's extreme secrecy had attracted attention from intelligence agencies and scientific institutions worldwide. Western intelligence services had been tracking reports of unusual aerial phenomena in the Soviet Union since the mid-1950s, with particular focus on incidents that might indicate advanced weapons development or foreign intervention. The Dyatlov Pass incident had been identified as potentially significant, leading to comprehensive efforts to gather information about the investigation and its findings. The scientific community's interest had been triggered by leaked reports of the victims' unusual injuries and the radiation contamination discovered on their clothing. These details suggested phenomena that challenged conventional understanding of atmospheric physics and materials science, making the incident relevant to researchers studying unexplained aerial phenomena worldwide. By the early 1990s, Yudin had assembled enough evidence to support a comprehensive re-examination of the incident. His documentation included classified materials, witness testimonies, and technical analyses that had been suppressed for decades. The picture that emerged was of an encounter with phenomena that defied conventional explanation, followed by a systematic cover-up that had persisted for 30 years. The truth about the Dyatlov Pass incident was finally beginning to emerge, but the full implications of what had occurred that February night in the Ural Mountains would prove to be even more disturbing than the original mystery. The cover-up had succeeded in suppressing the evidence, but it had also prevented understanding of phenomena that might have posed ongoing threats to public safety. As the Soviet Union collapsed and classified documents began to be released, the Dyatlov Pass incident would emerge as one of the most significant unexplained events of the Cold War era. The evidence suggested that 9 young mountaineers had encountered something that challenged fundamental assumptions about physics, technology, and the nature of reality itself. The declassification of Soviet archives in the 1990s provided the final pieces of the Dyatlov Pass puzzle. Documents released under pressure from victims' families and international researchers revealed the true scope of the incident and the sophisticated nature of the phenomena involved. The most significant revelation came from the files of the Soviet Air Defense Command, which had been tracking unusual aerial activities in the Ural region since October 1958. The documents revealed a pattern of encounters with objects that demonstrated flight characteristics beyond any known technology, including the ability to hover motionless in severe weather conditions and accelerate to supersonic speeds without producing sonic booms. These encounters had involved multiple radar installations and fighter aircraft across a region spanning hundreds of kilometers. The objects had demonstrated apparent awareness of Soviet air defense capabilities, avoiding direct engagement while maintaining operational presence in sensitive areas. The pattern suggested systematic reconnaissance or testing activities by entities with advanced technological capabilities. The night of February 1st to 2nd had represented the climax of 4 months of increasing aerial activity. Radar installations had detected multiple objects converging on the region where the Dyatlov expedition had established their camp. The objects had maintained positions consistent with observation or examination of the mountaineers' activities. Fighter aircraft dispatched to intercept the objects had encountered phenomena that challenged their understanding of atmospheric physics. Squadron leader Bartolome's complete mission report, classified for 30 years, described an encounter with a luminous object that had appeared to respond intelligently to his aircraft's approach. The object had maintained a perfect circular formation while emitting a pulsing orange light that seemed to affect his aircraft's electrical systems. Radio communications had been disrupted, navigation instruments had malfunctioned, and the aircraft's engines had experienced power fluctuations that couldn't be explained by mechanical failure or weather conditions. Most significantly, the object had demonstrated the ability to project focused beams of light toward the ground. Multiple witnesses, including the fighter pilot, radar operators, and personnel at ground installations, had observed these beams. The beams had moved in systematic patterns, as if conducting detailed examinations of specific terrain features. Military intelligence immediately recognized the correlation between these aerial observations and the location of the Dyatlov expedition's camp. The timing of the increased aerial activity, the focus on the specific region where the mountaineers were traveling, and the subsequent discovery of their deaths had created a pattern that suggested direct causation. The military's investigation had concluded that the expedition members had been present during an active reconnaissance or examination operation by entities with advanced technological capabilities. The mountaineers' tent had been positioned in a location that would have provided optimal observation of the aerial activities, making their presence a potential complication for whatever operations were being conducted. The evidence indicated that the expedition members had observed phenomena classified at the highest levels of state security. Their sudden evacuation from the tent, the organized nature of their departure, and their subsequent actions all indicated a group that had encountered something extraordinary and had attempted to respond according to predetermined protocols. Military investigators had extensively questioned the missing expedition member, Yuri Yudin, about the group's preparation and equipment. Yuri Yudin's testimony revealed that the expedition had equipped itself with cameras, measurement devices, and communication equipment that exceeded typical mountaineering requirements. This implied that the group had been aware of the area's odd activities and planned to record them. Researchers traced the radiation contamination on the victims' clothing to exposure to exotic materials not found naturally in the region. The isotopes detected were consistent with advanced propulsion systems or energy generation technologies that exceeded contemporary Soviet capabilities. This suggested that the expedition members had been near technological systems that were far beyond current human development. Exposure to directed energy weapons or atmospheric manipulation technologies caused the internal injuries suffered by the ravine victims. The trauma patterns were consistent with sudden changes in air pressure that had created implosive forces within the victims' bodies. Only technologies capable of precise atmospheric manipulation over localized areas could produce such effects. The selective tissue damage observed in Lyudmila Dubinina's remains had been caused by exposure to focused electromagnetic energy. The precision of the damage and the selective nature of the tissue removal suggested surgical-level precision that was beyond any known medical or weapons technology of the era. The local Mansi population's testimony, systematically suppressed during the original investigation, provided the final piece of the puzzle. The indigenous hunters had observed similar phenomena in the region for generations, describing encounters with sky people who conducted periodic examinations of the area and its wildlife. These accounts, dismissed as folklore by Soviet investigators, provided crucial context for understanding the broader pattern of activities in the region. The Mansi had developed cultural protocols for avoiding contact with these entities, including specific areas that were considered dangerous during certain seasonal periods. The Dyatlov expedition had unknowingly violated these traditional restrictions, establishing their camp in a location that the Mansi considered forbidden during winter months. Soviet authorities ignored the indigenous population's warnings, dismissing such concerns as superstition, incompatible with scientific socialism. The cover-up of the incident had been motivated by the Soviet government's inability to explain phenomena that challenge fundamental assumptions about technology, physics, and the nature of reality itself. The evidence pointed to encounters with entities possessing technological capabilities that exceeded human development by decades or centuries. The implications of acknowledging such encounters would have been devastating to Soviet scientific credibility and national security doctrine. The government's response had been to classify the entire incident and implement security protocols that would prevent similar information from becoming public. The truth about the Dyatlov Pass incident was that 9 young mountaineers had encountered evidence of non-human intelligence operating in Earth's atmosphere. Their deaths had been the result of being present during active reconnaissance operations by entities with advanced technological capabilities. The subsequent cover-up had been designed to prevent public awareness of phenomena that government officials couldn't explain or control. The incident represented one of the most significant encounters between human civilization and non-human intelligence in recorded history. The evidence had been systematically suppressed, but the truth had gradually emerged through the persistence of survivors, investigators, and researchers who had refused to accept official explanations that contradicted the physical evidence. As the Soviet Union collapsed and classified documents became available, the Dyatlov Pass incident emerged as a cornerstone case in the study of unexplained aerial phenomena. The comprehensive documentation, multiple witness testimonies, and physical evidence offered novel perspectives on encounters that challenged conventional understanding of technology and intelligence. The 9 members of the Dyatlov expedition had become unwitting participants in one of history's most significant contact events. Their deaths had been the tragic result of being present during operations by entities whose technological capabilities exceeded human understanding. The cover-up had succeeded in suppressing this truth for decades, but the evidence had ultimately proven too compelling to remain hidden. Today, the Dyatlov Pass incident stands as a testament to the courage of individuals who pursued truth despite official discouragement and personal risk. The mountaineers who died in the Ural Mountains that February night had encountered something that would challenge humanity's understanding of its place in the universe. Their story, finally told in its entirety, represents one of the most extraordinary chapters in the hidden history of human contact with non-human intelligence. The investigation that began as a search for missing mountaineers had uncovered evidence of phenomena that would reshape understanding of technology, physics, and the nature of intelligence itself. The truth about the Dyatlov Pass incident was far stranger and more significant than anyone had initially imagined, representing a pivotal moment in the secret history of human encounters with the unknown.
The town of Ridgway, Georgia, was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, or at least, that's what people like to believe. With a population of just over 3,000, it was small enough that a new face stood out, but large enough for people to disappear without immediate notice. For years, an unsettling pattern had been forming. People vanished without a trace, their disappearances separated by months, sometimes years, leaving behind only unanswered questions. First, it was a drifter, a man no one really knew, last seen near a roadside gas station. Then, a local waitress, young and full of life, who clocked out of her shift one night and was never seen again. As time passed, the missing persons report stacked up. A mechanic, a retired school teacher, a delivery driver, each one vanishing without a clue. But the town's rural isolation and slow-moving authorities meant cases went cold fast. Some believed the victims had just left town, seeking better opportunities, while others whispered rumors about something darker lurking beneath the town's quiet surface. What made the disappearances particularly strange was their lack of connection. The missing people had nothing in common. Different ages, genders, and backgrounds, making it impossible to establish a clear motive. Some believed the disappearances were coincidences. Others thought it was bad luck. But no one imagined the truth that lay just beneath their feet. The local sheriff, a man who had held the job for over 2 decades, dismissed the concerns as runaways or accidents, reluctant to stir fear in the community. But when Deputy Marcus Hale, a new officer fresh out of the state academy, was assigned to look into the missing persons cases, he noticed something chilling. Every one of the victims had, at some point, interacted with a local handyman, a quiet, unassuming man named Carl Henshaw, known for fixing pipes, repairing roofs, and working on septic systems. Hale's gut told him something wasn't right, but with no evidence and a town unwilling to believe that one of their own could be a monster, his suspicions remained just that, suspicions. For now, the town slept soundly, unaware that a nightmare had been growing in its backyard for years. It started as a simple service call, nothing out of the ordinary for a town like Ridgway, where old houses and aging infrastructure kept local tradesmen in business. Wayne Calloway, a local plumber known for his meticulous work, had received multiple complaints about a foul stench lingering near the edge of town, close to a property owned by none other than Carl Henshaw. The smell was unbearable, a sickly mix of rot and sewage that clung to the humid air like a curse. Neighbors, those who lived closest to the property, had noticed it getting worse over time, but they assumed it was just another case of a backed-up system or a dead animal rotting beneath the floorboards. Some even joked that Carl was just a filthy old man who didn't take care of his property. But Wayne had been in the plumbing business for 30 years, and he knew the difference between a bad septic system and the stench of death. With his toolkit in hand, he pulled up to Henshaw's property, a run-down single-story house surrounded by waist-high weeds and rusting equipment. The septic tank sat in the backyard, partially hidden by a row of discarded pipes and a half-buried bathtub. Wayne muttered under his breath, already dreading the work ahead. But as he got closer, his stomach turned. The smell was different. It wasn't just sewage. It was something far worse. Gagging, he covered his nose with his sleeve and examined the ground. The soil near the tank was dark and damp, almost like it had been recently disturbed. His boots sank slightly into the mud, and something about it sent an uneasy chill down his spine. Swallowing his discomfort, he pried open the rusted metal lid of the septic tank, expecting to see sludge and waste. What he saw instead would haunt him for the rest of his life. A bloated human hand, its flesh swollen and pale, floated just beneath the surface of the thick, dark liquid. At first, Wayne thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. He blinked, staggering backward, his brain struggling to rationalize what he was seeing. But the truth was undeniable. He wasn't looking at sewage. He was looking at decay. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone, fumbling to dial 911. The smell seemed to thicken in the air as he waited, the seconds stretching into an eternity. When the dispatcher answered, his voice cracked as he choked out the words. I think there's a body in the septic tank." Within minutes, the sheriff's department arrived, their flashing red and blue lights painting the overgrown yard in shifting colors. Deputies moved in cautiously, their faces turning pale as they caught the first whiff of the scene. The sheriff, who had dismissed the disappearances for years, stood in stunned silence as he peered into the tank. There was no denying it now. Ridgeway had a killer in its midst. The forensic team was called in, and the area was cordoned off as an active crime scene. By the time the sun set, the once quiet property was swarming with investigators, crime scene analysts, and journalists who had caught wind of the gruesome discovery. As authorities worked through the night, they drained the septic tank, and what they found inside would shock the entire town. Not just one body, but fragments of several. Pieces of human bone, rotting flesh, and tattered clothing surfaced from the murky depths, confirming what no one had wanted to believe. This was no accident. This was a dumping ground. Carl Henshaw had nowhere to hide. His quiet, unassuming life had just been ripped open, like the rusted lid of his septic tank, and the entire town was about to learn the monstrous truth that had been festering beneath their feet for years. The news of the septic tank discovery spread through Ridgeway like wildfire, igniting a storm of fear, speculation, and disbelief. People who had once waved at Carl Henshaw in passing now whispered his name in hushed, horrified tones. How had a man who lived among them for over 2 decades managed to hide such unimaginable darkness? How had he attended church gatherings, shopped at the local grocery store, and fixed their broken pipes while secretly disposing of human remains in his own backyard? The more the town thought about it, the more disturbing it became. Carl Henshaw was an unremarkable man by all appearances. He was in his late 50s, his face weathered from years of outdoor labor, his hands rough and calloused from fixing things that others had broken. He never married, never had children, and never seemed particularly close to anyone. He kept his head down and worked odd jobs, fixing roofs, clearing out septic tanks, and repairing plumbing. To most people, he was just another handyman, the kind of man you called when something went wrong. He lived in a modest home on the outskirts of town, a place so cluttered with scrap metal and broken tools that people rarely ventured past the front yard. Yet behind those rusting gates and overgrown weeds, a nightmare had unfolded, one that had gone unnoticed for years. As investigators dug deeper into Carl's past, They began to connect the dots between him and the missing persons cases that had plagued Ridgeway for nearly 2 decades. Records showed that every victim had either hired Carl for repairs or had some minor interaction with him before they vanished. A few had called him for plumbing work. Others had seen him at local job sites. Some had merely crossed his path by chance. It was a pattern that had gone undetected until now. The more the police searched his property, the darker the discoveries became. Inside his house, they found a workshop of horrors. There were boxes filled with random personal items, watches, wallets, shoes, belonging to people who were no longer alive. A hidden crawl space beneath his home contained tattered clothing, some still stained with dried blood. But the most disturbing discovery was found in his basement, a collection of videotapes labeled with dates that matched the disappearances. Investigators watched in stunned horror as they realized what the tapes contained: recordings of his victims. Some showed them pleading for their lives. Others captured the eerie normalcy of Carl's interactions with them before their final moments. He had filmed them in his home, sometimes offering them food, sometimes calmly chatting before the inevitable. As more details emerged, the town's shock turned into dread. Carl wasn't just a killer, he was a hunter. He had used his occupation as a handyman to move unnoticed, a ghost who could slip into people's homes under the guise of fixing a leak or repairing a drain. No one had ever suspected him, because he was always there, a fixture of the community, the quiet man who never made trouble. Even more chilling was the realization that Carl had likely been in the homes of nearly everyone in town at some point. Had they been close to becoming victims themselves? Had they unknowingly let a monster into their homes? The sheer thought sent shivers down their spines. As authorities built their case, Carl Henshaw refused to speak. He remained calm and silent as they led him away, his expression unreadable. The man who had spent years hiding in plain sight had finally been exposed, but the true depths of his evil had yet to be fully uncovered. As authorities dug deeper, both figuratively and literally, the full scale of Carl Henshaw's horrors began to unfold. The septic tank had been only the beginning, a gruesome gateway into a nightmare far worse than anyone in Ridgeway could have imagined. Investigators drained the entire system, a slow, stomach-turning process that unearthed years of horror buried beneath the surface. What they recovered was not just human remains, but a timeline of death, a layered history of victims, their bones and tissue interwoven with the sludge. Forensic teams worked tirelessly, cataloging every bone fragment, every piece of clothing, every piece of evidence that could help identify the faceless victims. The problem was that many of the remains had been liquefied over time. Their DNA dissolved into the filth, making identification nearly impossible. Some remains were older than others, showing that Carl's killing spree had lasted far longer than anyone had initially believed. Some forensic experts estimated that the earliest remains could date back 20 years, meaning that Carl had been killing long before the town even suspected anything. Beyond the septic tank, authorities expanded their search to the rest of Carl's property, and what they found was even more disturbing. In his shed, they discovered rusted tools stained with blood, handcuffs, and a makeshift operating table covered in deep scratches and dried stains. Nearby, a collection of jars held teeth and fingernails, carefully preserved as if they were trophies. An old wooden trunk in his basement contained Polaroid photographs, hundreds of them, each depicting a different victim, some alive, some already dead, some in various stages of decomposition. The most horrifying revelation, however, came when they searched Carl's well, a deep, stone-lined pit just a few yards away from his house. Authorities had assumed it was abandoned, just another piece of old farm infrastructure. But when they removed the rotting wooden cover, the smell that erupted from it was indescribable. Using specialized equipment, they lowered a camera into the darkness, and what they saw made even the most seasoned officers turn away in disgust. At the bottom of the well, tangled together in a mass of decay, were dozens of human skulls. Some had been there for so long that the bone had turned brittle. Others were more recent, still clinging to patches of flesh. It became horrifyingly clear that Carl Henshaw had not just been disposing of his victims in the septic tank. He had been using multiple locations to hide his crimes. As the evidence piled up, the psychological weight of the case crushed the town. People who had once trusted Carl, who had invited him into their homes, who had even shared casual conversations with him, now realized that they had been living alongside a monster. Some of the victims' families had spent years searching for answers, hoping their loved ones had simply moved away or started new lives elsewhere. Now, they were faced with the unbearable truth. Their loved ones had been murdered and disposed of like waste, their final resting place a putrid pit of human remains and sewage. The town of Ridgeway would never be the same again. The discovery of Carl's true nature shattered its sense of safety. The idea that a man who had been part of their daily lives was secretly one of the most depraved killers in modern history was too much to process. Some refused to believe it at first. Some tried to erase every memory they had of Carl, and others simply packed their bags and left town, unable to exist in a place so tainted by horror. Even the lead investigators on the case were deeply affected. The sheer gruesomeness of Carl's crimes, the way he had calmly lived among his victims' families, fixing their sinks and unclogging their drains while their loved ones rotted beneath his feet, was something they would never forget. The case was now a national headline, drawing attention from criminologists, psychologists, and media outlets all seeking to understand how a man like Carl Henshaw had managed to go unnoticed for so long. But while the town struggled to grasp the nightmare they had uncovered, Carl himself remained silent. He refused to speak during interrogations, his expression blank, his eyes empty. He did not fight the accusations. He did not deny what he had done. He simply sat there, as if he were completely detached from the horror he had created. Yet in the minds of those who had once called him a neighbor, there was only one question that mattered. Why? As the trial of Carl Henshaw began, the world turned its gaze toward Ridgeway. What had once been a small, forgotten town was now the center of one of the most disturbing murder cases in American history. National media outlets flooded the streets, cameras rolling as journalists scrambled to capture every detail of the case. True crime enthusiasts, criminal psychologists, and even FBI profilers all sought to understand the mind of the man who had lived among his victims, shared spaces with their grieving families, and disposed of bodies in the very systems meant to carry away waste. But Carl Henshaw was not an easy subject to analyze. Unlike most serial killers, he did not seek notoriety, nor did he leave behind a calling card. He was methodical, calculated, and, above all, coldly efficient in his work. Inside the courtroom, Carl sat motionless, his expression unreadable. He had refused to cooperate with investigators, refused to answer questions, and refused to explain his crimes. Some believed he was waiting. For what? No one knew. Others believed he simply did not care. His defense attorneys attempted to paint him as mentally unstable, citing possible schizophrenia, psychopathy, or dissociative identity disorder. But the prosecution argued something even more chilling. Carl Henshaw was not insane. He was fully aware of what he had done. He had planned, executed, and hid his crimes for decades, living a double life with disturbing precision. The testimonies of criminal psychologists and FBI profilers painted a deeply unsettling portrait of Carl. Unlike many serial killers who were driven by passion, anger, or uncontrollable urges, Carl was motivated by something far more insidious, a sense of purity. He saw himself as a cleaner, a remover of waste, both literal and metaphorical. In his mind, the people he killed were filth, individuals he deemed unworthy of existence. His victims were chosen seemingly at random, yet all of them had, in some way, crossed his path during his work. Some were rude customers, others were simply too inquisitive, and some, perhaps most disturbingly, were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. To Carl, they were all disposable, just like the sewage he worked with daily. During the trial, forensic analysts presented the gruesome evidence: the bones recovered from his septic tank, the well filled with human skulls, the videotapes, the personal belongings of his victims carefully stored in his basement. The jury shuddered as they watched footage from his tapes, recordings of unsuspecting victims talking, laughing, even sitting at his kitchen table before they were murdered. Carl had documented his own atrocities, not out of a need for remembrance, but as a ritual. He watched those tapes alone, in his dimly lit home, replaying the moments where he took control over another human life. One of the most haunting moments of the trial came when the prosecution displayed a ledger found in Carl's home. It contained names, dates, and chilling notes beside each entry. Some names had X's next to them. Those were the ones found in the septic tank. Others had question marks, likely intended victims who had unknowingly escaped their fate. The final pages of the ledger contained new names, people from town, some of whom were sitting in the very courtroom, neighbors, shopkeepers, even the sheriff. It became clear that Carl had never planned to stop. As the trial stretched on, families of the victims sat in silent grief, their faces pale and hollowed by the weight of their suffering. Some demanded the death penalty, wanting Carl to suffer the same fate he had inflicted on so many others. Others simply wanted to know why, an answer that never came. When the verdict was finally read, the courtroom was silent. Carl Henshaw was found guilty on all counts. Multiple charges of first-degree murder, kidnapping, desecration of human remains, and obstruction of justice. The judge, unable to contain their disgust, sentenced him to multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. Yet, even as the gavel struck, Carl's expression never changed. He simply nodded, as if he had already accepted his fate long before his capture. As guards escorted him from the courtroom, a reporter shouted, "Why did you do it, Carl? What made you kill them?" For the first time, Carl stopped. He turned his head ever so slightly, and with a voice as calm as ever, he said, "Because it was easy." And just like that, he was gone, vanishing behind prison doors, leaving behind a trail of horror that would haunt Ridgeway forever. Even after Carl Henshaw was locked away, his presence still lingered over Ridgeway like a dark shadow that refused to lift. The town was never the same again. The discovery of his crimes had left an unhealable wound, one that stretched far beyond the families of the victims. People who had once prided themselves on the town's close-knit community now saw each other with suspicion. They had lived beside a monster for decades. They had spoken to him, trusted him, let him into their homes. The realization that they had unknowingly been in the presence of pure evil left behind a paralyzing fear, a fear that would never fully fade. Many of the victims' families never recovered. Some moved away, unable to bear the sight of the places where their loved ones had last been seen. Some refused to sell their homes, clinging to what little they had left, a desperate attempt to hold on to the memories before the nightmare began. But for those who stayed, life became a daily struggle with paranoia. The once friendly neighborhood streets were now eerily quiet. Doors were triple-locked. Strangers were eyed with suspicion. Even the sound of a passing truck at night sent shivers down spines, a cruel reminder of how easily someone could disappear. Businesses suffered. People stopped calling for handymen, plumbers, or repair workers, afraid that another Carl Henshaw might be lurking among them. The local motel, once a quiet resting spot for travelers, was abandoned after it was revealed that one of Carl's earliest victims had last been seen checking in there before vanishing forever. Some streets were never the same, especially the ones where Carl had worked most often. The properties he had fixed, the yards he had mowed, the pipes he had repaired. Each one felt tainted, cursed, as if the walls themselves had absorbed his horrors. Some homes were left vacant, as their owners could not bear to live in a place where Carl had once walked freely. Psychologists and true crime experts continued to study Carl's case, trying to piece together the mind of a man who had fooled an entire town. Books were written, documentaries were filmed, yet no matter how much was uncovered, one question always remained unanswered. How many victims had there truly been? The official count, based on remains found in the septic tank, well, and other locations, stood at 32 confirmed murders, but investigators feared the real number could be far higher. Some victims may have been disposed of in places never discovered, their existence erased so thoroughly that no one would ever know they had once lived. Some cases remained open-ended, as bodies were too decomposed to be identified. And even more chillingly, there were still names in Carl's ledger that had never been found. Were they buried somewhere else, burned, or had he simply let some go, watching them from afar, knowing they would never know how close they came to death? Carl's house was bulldozed within weeks of his conviction, but even that did little to erase his legacy of terror. Some people believed the land itself was cursed, that the soil had soaked up too much death to ever be clean again. A few thrill-seekers and paranormal investigators tried to visit the site at night, convinced that spirits of his victims still lingered, but even they left quickly, saying the place felt wrong, like it was watching them. Ridgeway became a ghost town in spirit, even if people still lived there. The case of the septic tank killer was etched into history, a cautionary tale that would be told for generations. Parents warned their children to never trust a stranger, to always be aware of their surroundings. But the most terrifying part of all was the realization that no one had ever suspected him. If Carl Henshaw could live unnoticed among them for so long, who else out there was doing the same? The thought was enough to keep anyone from sleeping soundly ever again.
You're settling in for the night, maybe with a cup of chamomile tea or that last bit of wine from dinner, and your mind starts wandering to one of history's most frustrating puzzles. Not the kind that keeps you up staring at the ceiling, more like the kind that makes you feel pleasantly drowsy, while your brain does that gentle tumbling thing it does when it's processing something intriguing but not urgent. The Lost Colony of Roanoke. Over the years, You've likely heard fragments of information about the lost colony of Roanoke, perhaps seen a documentary about it, or come across a mention in some historical fiction. But there's something deliciously unsettling about the whole thing that makes it perfect for this quiet moment before sleep. Not scary, unsettling. More like the feeling you get when you realise you've misplaced your reading glasses and then spend 10 minutes looking for them while they're sitting on top of your head. Picture this. It's 1587, and you're part of a group of English settlers heading to what would eventually become North Carolina. You're probably wearing uncomfortable clothes, your teeth could use some serious dental work, and the boat ride has been exactly as pleasant as you'd expect from a 16th century ocean voyage. But you're hopeful. You're starting fresh in a new world, building something from scratch, maybe leaving behind some drama or debt or just the general stuffiness of Elizabethan England. Your leader is a fellow named John White. Not the most charismatic name in history, admittedly, but he seems decent enough. He's actually an artist, which is rather sweet when you think about it. Rather than a stern military leader, you have someone who observes the way light interacts with water and likely enjoys sketching birds in his free time. White has been to this area before, so he knows the territory, sort of. Well, he thinks he does. The plan is straightforward. Establish a colony, grow some crops, trade with the local Croatoan people who seem reasonably friendly, and eventually create a thriving English settlement. Simple enough, right? You've brought families this time, men, women, children, even a pregnant woman named Eleanor, who happens to be John White's daughter. This is not an expedition filled with soldiers and fortune seekers. This town is meant to be a real community, with people planning to put down roots and build actual lives. And for a little while, things go okay. Not great. Nothing ever goes great when you're essentially camping in the wilderness while trying to construct civilization from scratch. But okay, you build some houses, plant some gardens, and meet some neighbours. Eleanor gives birth to a little girl named Virginia Dare, who becomes the first English child born in North America. There's something both hopeful and slightly ominous about that distinction, though you don't know it yet. But then problems start cropping up, the way they always do when people are stressed and living in close quarters with limited resources. Food supplies are running lower than expected. Some of the neighbouring indigenous groups are less welcoming than hoped, partly because previous English visitors hadn't exactly been model guests. There are misunderstandings, tensions, and the occasional skirmish. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to make everyone a bit jumpy. John White finds himself in an impossible position. The colony needs supplies, food, tools, medicine, all the things you can't exactly improvise in the wilderness. Someone has to go back to England to get help, and the leader is obviously him. But leaving means abandoning his daughter and brand new granddaughter, along with everyone else who's counting on him. It's the kind of decision that would give anyone stress dreams. Stay and watch everyone slowly starve, or get picked off by various dangers, or leave and hope you can make it back before something terrible happens. White chooses to leave, promising to return as quickly as possible with supplies and reinforcements. As his ship disappears over the horizon, you're left standing on the shore with about 115 other colonists, watching your lifeline sail away. The ocean looks huge suddenly, and England feels very far away. But you're committed now. This is home, for better or worse. You settle into a routine of sorts, tending crops, maintaining buildings, and trying to establish better relationships with your neighbours. Days pass, then weeks, then months. Winter comes and goes. Spring arrives. You keep expecting to see ships on the horizon, but the horizon remains stubbornly empty. One day you come to a startling realisation. John White has been gone for nearly 3 years. Where is he? 3 years. You've been counting because it helps maintain the illusion that time is still moving in a predictable way, that there's still a connection to the world you came from. 3 years since you watched John White's ship disappear, taking with it your main link to supplies, reinforcements, and news from home. At first, everyone had reasonable explanations for the delay. Ocean voyages were unpredictable. Storms, pirates, navigation errors, and mechanical problems. Ships sank with depressing regularity in those days. Maybe White's vessel had been damaged and needed extensive repairs. Maybe he'd had trouble convincing investors to fund a return voyage. Maybe Queen Elizabeth had other priorities. There were always wars or political crises or economic troubles that could divert attention and resources. You'd developed little rituals around watching for ships. Someone would climb the tallest tree each morning to scan the horizon. Others would take evening walks along the beach, squinting at distant clouds that might, from the right angle and with enough wishful thinking, look like sails. Children made games of it, competing to be the first to spot the rescue ships that never came. But as months stretched into years, those hopeful habits began to feel hollow. The morning tree climbing became less frequent, then stopped altogether. Beach walks continued, but more for exercise and contemplation than for ship spotting. The children found other games. During this endless waiting period, you've learned things about yourself and your fellow colonists that you never expected to discover. You've learned that Margaret Harrison has an absolutely filthy sense of humour when she thinks no one important is listening. You've discovered that Thomas Cooper, who seemed like such a practical, level-headed fellow back in England, becomes completely irrational when he can't find his favourite hammer. You've watched Eleanor White Dare transform from a nervous new mother into someone who could probably run a small government if necessary. The colony has developed its own rhythms, its own internal politics, and its own little dramas and alliances. People have paired off, broken up, reconciled, argued over garden boundaries, shared recipes, borrowed tools, and gossiped about each other's laundry habits. It's become a real community, which is both comforting and slightly tragic under the circumstances. Your relationship with the Croatoan people has evolved too, though it's complicated. Some individuals have been genuinely helpful, sharing knowledge about local plants, weather patterns, and seasonal changes. Others remain suspicious or hostile, and you can hardly blame them. Your presence represents a permanent change to their world, whether you intended it or not. The language barrier creates endless opportunities for misunderstandings, some amusing, and others less so. You've learned to recognize certain words and phrases, and developed a basic vocabulary of gestures and expressions that help with simple communications. But nuanced conversations remain nearly impossible, which means you're never quite sure where you stand with your neighbours. Food has become an ongoing source of low-level anxiety. You've learned to eat things you never imagined consuming, roots, berries, and various aquatic creatures that look like they belonged in a medieval bestiary rather than on a dinner plate. Some of these discoveries have been pleasant surprises. Others have been less pleasant. You've developed a healthy respect for the trial and error process of identifying edible plants, especially after Thomas Cooper's unfortunate encounter with what everyone now refers to as the incident with the purple berries. The seasons have become more meaningful than they ever were back in England. You notice changes in daylight, temperature, and weather patterns with the intensity of someone whose life actually depends on such things. You've learned to read the sky, to predict storms, and to recognize the subtle signs that indicate when to plant, when to harvest, and when to prepare for winter. Your sleeping patterns have changed too. Without candles to waste or oil lamps to maintain, you've fallen into a rhythm that follows natural light more closely. You sleep deeper and wake more naturally, though your dreams have become more vivid and sometimes strange. Maybe it's the diet, or the stress, or just the way your brain processes this surreal situation of being possibly forgotten by the entire civilized world. But the most unsettling realization is this: you've stopped talking about when the rescue ships arrive and started talking about if they arrive. It's a small change in language, but it represents a massive shift in thinking. You're no longer temporary residents waiting for transportation home. You're permanent settlers who may never see England again. The question that keeps surfacing, usually late at night, when you're lying awake listening to unfamiliar sounds in the darkness, is this: what happens if no one ever comes? By the 4th year, you've all implicitly accepted the reality that no one wants to publicly express. You're on your own. John White isn't coming back, at least not anytime soon, and possibly not ever. The reasons don't matter anymore. War, shipwreck, political upheaval, financial problems, or maybe he simply got distracted by some other opportunity. The result is the same either way. This realization has brought a strange kind of relief along with the obvious anxiety. The waiting is over. Certainty about abandonment has replaced the uncertainty about rescue, and working with certainty, even unpleasant certainty, is easier than endless hope. You can make plans now, real plans, instead of just marking time until someone else solves your problems. The colony's leadership has shifted subtly but noticeably. Without an appointed governor, decisions get made by consensus, argument, or sometimes just by whoever feels strongly enough about something to take charge. Eleanor White-Dare has emerged as a natural leader, partly because she's John White's daughter, and partly because she's simply adept at organising people and resources. Her daughter Virginia, now a walking, talking 4-year-old, has become everyone's child, a living symbol of the colony's commitment to staying put. You've also had to confront some uncomfortable realities about your situation. Food security remains problematic. You've learned to cultivate local crops and preserve seasonal abundance, but you're always one disastrous harvest or severe winter away from serious trouble. The indigenous neighbours continue to be unpredictable, sometimes helpful, sometimes hostile, always operating according to social rules you don't fully understand. Your housing situation has evolved from temporary shelters to more permanent structures, but permanent is relative when you're working with local materials and limited tools. Roofs leak, walls warp, and foundations settle in unexpected ways. Everything requires constant maintenance, which might be normal for colonial life, but it feels particularly precarious when you realise there's no possibility of ordering replacement materials from England. Medical care has become a community responsibility handled by a combination of folk remedies, trial and error, and prayer. Margaret Harrison turned out to have a knack for healing, probably based on knowledge she'd picked up from her grandmother back home, combined with careful observation of what works and what doesn't. But serious injuries or illnesses remain terrifying because there's no doctor, no pharmacy, and no hospital within several thousand miles. The psychological adjustment has been harder than the practical challenges. You've grieved the life you left behind, not just the people and places, but the assumptions about how the world works. In England, you were part of a complex, established society with rules, institutions, and safety nets. Here, you're essentially making up civilization as you go along, which is both liberating and exhausting. Some colonists have adapted better than others. A few have thrived in this environment, discovering capabilities they never knew they possessed. Others have struggled with depression and anxiety, or what we might now recognise as PTSD from the constant stress of survival. There's been at least one suicide, and several people have simply wandered off into the wilderness, either deliberately or because they became confused and disoriented. But here's the thing that keeps you awake sometimes, staring up at stars that seem brighter and more numerous than they ever did back home. You've started to suspect that staying might not be entirely voluntary anymore. You've evolved in ways that could make reintegrating into English society challenging or unfeasible, not due to any external force holding you captive. You've learned to track animals, identify medicinal plants, predict weather patterns, and navigate by natural landmarks. You've developed relationships with people whose names you can't properly pronounce but whose faces have become as familiar as family. You've adapted to a rhythm of life that follows seasons rather than clocks and natural light rather than artificial schedules. Would you even fit back into English society now? Could you readjust to having neighbours you've never spoken to buying food instead of growing it, and to following laws made by people who live hundreds of miles away? Would people value the skills you've developed here, such as patience, resourcefulness, and the ability to find solutions using only what's immediately available? Or would they view them as eccentricities? And there's Virginia to consider. She's never known any world but this one. England would be as foreign to her as this place once was to you. She speaks English, but she also knows Croatoan words and gestures. She's equally comfortable with European games and indigenous traditions. She belongs here in a way that you're still learning. The question isn't just about survival anymore. It's about identity, belonging, and what home means when the place you came from is now more foreign than the one you've made. But the alternative, staying put and hoping tensions resolve themselves, feels increasingly unrealistic. There's been talk of violence, rumours of coordinated action against the colony, reports of weapons being gathered, and alliances being formed. You don't know how much of this is accurate intelligence and how much is anxiety-fueled speculation, but you can't afford to assume the best-case scenario. The decision gets made gradually, then suddenly. Someone suggests that advanced scouts should visit Croatoan Island to assess the situation and begin negotiations. Someone else volunteers to start organising supplies for a potential move. A third person begins making lists of what's essential and what can be left behind. Before anyone officially declares that the colony is relocating, everyone's acting as if the decision has already been made. You find yourself caught up in the strange energy of dismantling a life you've spent years building. Possessions get sorted into piles. Absolutely necessary, probably useful, would be nice to have and might as well leave it. The process is both liberating and heartbreaking. You're shedding not just objects, but attachments, memories, the physical evidence of your attempts to create permanence in an impermanent world. Some colonists are handling the transition better than others. A few seem almost excited about the prospect of starting fresh somewhere new, treating it as an adventure rather than an evacuation. Others are clearly struggling with what feels like another abandonment, another failure to establish the stable community they'd hoped to create. There's grief mixed with the practical preparations, a sense of loss that nobody wants to dwell on, because dwelling on it might make the necessary action impossible. The children are adapting with a resilience that children somehow manage to summon for situations that would break most adults. Virginia Dare, now approaching her 5th birthday, treats the whole thing as an elaborate game of packing and unpacking, helping to sort items while chattering about the boat ride and the new place where they'll live. Her cheerfulness is both encouraging and slightly devastating. As departure day approaches, you realise you're about to become part of one of history's great mysteries, though you have no way of knowing that yet. You're just people trying to survive, making the best decisions you can with incomplete information and limited options. But someone, someday, is going to want to know what happened to you. You've left clues because you're not stupid. Despite the chaos and urgency of packing up an entire community, despite the stress of negotiating safe passage with people who speak a different language, despite the 100 practical concerns that come with essentially becoming refugees in your own adopted homeland, you've thought about the future. Specifically, you've thought about John White. He might still come back. Probably not, but possibly, and if he does, he's going to find an empty settlement with no indication of what happened to the people he left behind. That would be cruel, leaving him to imagine the worst: massacre, starvation, disease, or some other catastrophe that wiped out his daughter, granddaughter, and everyone else he'd sworn to protect. So, you've left messages. It's not just you alone, but a team of individuals collaborating to guarantee that any potential searchers will discover solutions rather than merely enigmas. The most obvious message is carved into a post near the fort. Croatoan. It's simple, clear, and should be understandable to anyone familiar with the area. If John White returns, he'll know you've gone to Croatoan Island, and he'll know you went there voluntarily rather than under duress. There's also another carving, just CRO, on a nearby tree. We added this one partly as a backup, and partly because Thomas Cooper became enthusiastic about the carving project and wanted to contribute his own handiwork. It's less informative than the main message, but it reinforces the direction you've gone. The plan was to include more detailed information, perhaps a letter left in a waterproof container, or additional carvings explaining the circumstances of your departure. But time ran out faster than expected. The situation with your neighbours deteriorated more quickly than anyone anticipated, and what was supposed to be a carefully planned relocation became something closer to an urgent evacuation. You'd also discussed establishing some kind of signal system, perhaps arrange stones or mark trees that could guide rescue parties from the original settlement to your new location. But again, the reality of moving over 100 people with limited transportation and uncertain welcome made such elaborate precautions impossible. The departure itself was both more and less dramatic than you'd imagined. More dramatic because loading people and supplies into small boats while everyone's nervous about potentially hostile observers creates a lot of tension and shouting. Less dramatic because it was mostly just logistics. Who sits where, which boxes go in which boat, and how to keep the children calm and the adults from panicking. Eleanor insisted on one last walk through the settlement before leaving, taking Virginia with her to see the place where she'd been born. It was both sentimental and practical, making sure nothing essential had been forgotten, saying goodbye to a place that had been home for several years, and creating a memory that Virginia might carry forward even if she never sees this spot again. You found yourself doing the same thing, taking a final inventory of the structures you'd helped build, the gardens you'd helped plant, and the improvements you'd made to what had been wilderness when you first arrived. It wasn't sentiment exactly, but it wasn't entirely practical either. Maybe it was just the human need to acknowledge the significance of endings, to mark the transition between one phase of life and whatever comes next. The boat ride to Croatoan Island was long enough to give everyone time to think about what they were leaving behind and what they might be heading toward. Some people spent the journey looking back at the coastline that had been home, watching it shrink into the distance. Others faced forward, trying to spot their destination and imagine what life might be like in their new location. A few just closed their eyes and tried not to think about anything at all. Virginia fell asleep in her mother's arms partway through the voyage, lulled by the motion of the boat and the sound of water against the hull. Watching her sleep, so completely trusting that the adults around her would handle whatever needed to be handled, you felt the weight of responsibility that comes with making decisions that will shape someone else's entire future. You have made every effort to create a trail that any reasonable search party could follow. You've chosen a destination that offers the best available chance for survival and prosperity. You've maintained the unity of the community despite stress and uncertainty. You've made the hard choices that needed to be made. But, as the familiar coastline disappears behind you, and the unknown shoreline grows larger ahead, you can't shake the feeling that you're not just changing locations. You're disappearing from history, becoming part of a story that no one will ever be able to complete. The messages you left behind feel suddenly inadequate, too simple for the complexity of what's actually happening. Croatoan Island is both exactly what you expected and completely different from what you'd imagined. The physical landscape is familiar: sandy beaches, maritime forests, and the same plants and animals you'd learned to recognize over the past several years. But the social landscape is entirely new, and navigating it requires skills you're still developing. Though the term welcoming might be too strong, your hosts have been more welcoming than you'd dared to hope. Tolerant might be more accurate, or perhaps cautiously accommodating. While you negotiate longer-term arrangements, they've allowed you to establish temporary shelters and shared information about local resources, seasonal patterns, and potential hazards. But there's an underlying tension in these interactions, a sense that your presence here is provisional rather than permanent. The language barrier remains frustrating, though you're all getting better at the basic communications necessary for daily cooperation. You've learned to recognize words for common objects, actions, and concepts. More importantly, you've learned to read facial expressions, body language, and social cues that transcend specific vocabulary. You're developing a kind of intuitive understanding of when to approach someone with a request, when to offer help, and when to stay out of the way entirely. Virginia has adapted most quickly, as children always seem to do in these situations. She's picked up fragments of Croatoan language with the effortless facility that makes adults simultaneously envious and proud. She plays with local children using a combination of English words, Croatoan phrases, and the universal language of games that somehow transcends cultural boundaries. Watching her, you can see glimpses of what successful integration might look like, though you also realize it might take a generation to achieve. The practical challenges of establishing a new community have been complicated by the need to coordinate with existing residents who have their own established patterns, preferences, and priorities. You can't just clear land and build wherever seems convenient. You have to negotiate for space, for resources, and for permission to alter the landscape in ways that might affect other people. It's like trying to renovate a house while the original owners are still living in it, and haven't entirely decided they want you as permanent housemates. Food sharing has become a complex social ritual that you're still learning to navigate properly. To contribute to communal meals, you must know what's available, how it's prepared, and who provides what, when, and how much. There are protocols around hunting, fishing, and gathering that seem to involve seasonal restrictions, territorial boundaries, and hierarchical privileges that nobody has explicitly explained to you, but which you're expected to somehow intuit. The most delicate negotiations have involved marriage customs and family structures. Several of your fellow colonists are single, and some have expressed interest in local partners, but the social rules governing such relationships are complicated and culturally specific. There have been a few tentative courtships, some successful and others less so, all of which have required careful diplomacy to avoid creating conflicts that could jeopardize the entire community's welcome. You've also had to confront the reality that some aspects of English colonial culture are simply incompatible with Croatoan social norms. Your assumptions about property ownership, individual autonomy and social hierarchy don't translate directly, and insisting on English ways of doing things would be both impractical and politically unwise. You're learning to be more flexible, more observant, and more willing to adapt your behaviour to fit circumstances rather than expecting them to accommodate your preferences. But the strangest part of this integration process is the gradual realization that you're not just learning to live with different people, you're becoming different people yourselves. The stress of relocation, the challenge of cultural adaptation, and the daily necessity of cooperation have changed how you think, how you solve problems, how you relate to each other, and how you relate to the environment. You've developed new skills, new perspectives, and new priorities. Things that seemed critically important back in the original settlement, maintaining English customs, preserving European social distinctions, and planning for eventual return to civilization, have faded in significance. What matters now is immediate survival, successful cooperation, and the gradual construction of a hybrid community that draws from multiple cultural traditions without being entirely constrained by any of them. Late at night, lying in your temporary shelter listening to unfamiliar sounds and familiar voices, you sometimes wonder if the person you're becoming would be recognizable to the person who first arrived in the new world. You've traveled not just geographically, but also culturally, linguistically, and perhaps even psychologically. You're becoming someone new, someone who exists in the spaces between established identities. And Virginia, growing up in this hybrid world, will be something entirely unprecedented, a person who belongs fully to neither English nor Croatoan culture, but to both simultaneously. Years pass, and you gradually stop thinking of yourself as English colonists, temporarily residing among the Croatoan people. The distinction has blurred beyond recognition through daily cooperation, intermarriage, shared hardships, and the simple passage of time. Children born here, including Virginia, now a young woman who speaks Croatoan as fluently as English, belong to this place in ways that the original settlers never quite managed. You've become part of the community's seasonal rhythms, participating in ceremonies and traditions that would have seemed foreign and possibly threatening when you first arrived. You've learned to make tools, clothing and medicines using local materials and traditional techniques. More importantly, you've learned to think like someone whose survival depends on intimate knowledge of local conditions rather than imported solutions. The original English settlement feels like something that happened to different people in a different lifetime. When you occasionally think about John White, or wonder whether any ships ever return to look for you, it's with the detached curiosity you might feel about historical events that don't directly affect your current life. The emotional urgency of rescue has faded, replaced by the more immediate concerns of the community you've actually built. But lately, you've been having conversations, quiet, private conversations, about visibility and invisibility, about what it means to vanish from one world while becoming part of another. Some of the older colonists are concerned about the stories people will tell about your disappearance and the assumptions they will make about your fate. The idea that people who never knew the truth might interpret your successful adaptation as failure or tragedy is unsettling. Virginia has started asking questions about her origins, about the English grandfather she never met, and about the difference between the family she was born into and the family she's grown up with. Her questions stem not from dissatisfaction with her current life, but rather from the innate human curiosity about identity and belonging. She wants to understand not just who she is, but how she came to be who she is. These conversations have made you realize that you've become custodians of a story that will probably never be told accurately. The people who might someday investigate your disappearance will have access to the carved messages you left behind, but they won't have access to the complex social, political, and personal factors that made relocation necessary and integration possible. They'll find mystery where you experienced practical problem solving. You've also realized that the very success of your adaptation makes your story less visible to outside observers. If you'd all died dramatically, there might be obvious evidence, bones, abandoned belongings, signs of conflict or disaster. If you'd maintained a separate English community, there might be recognisable cultural artefacts, architectural remains, or other traces that clearly indicated European presence. But by integrating successfully, you've essentially disappeared into the existing cultural landscape. Your children and grandchildren will carry forward fragments of English language, customs and knowledge, but these will be woven into a larger cultural fabric that wouldn't necessarily be recognised as having European origins. A few words, some techniques for working with metal or preserving food, and stories about places across the ocean might persist for generations without anyone recognising them as evidence of the lost colony's fate. Sometimes, lying awake in the quiet hours before dawn, you imagine future historians puzzling over your disappearance. They'll have theories: disease, massacre, starvation, failed attempt to return to England. They'll analyse the carved messages, search for archaeological evidence, create elaborate explanations for what seems to them like an inexplicable vanishing. They'll never consider the most mundane and most profound possibility, that you simply became part of something larger than yourselves. The irony is that your story isn't really mysterious at all, at least not from the inside. You made rational decisions based on available information and circumstances. You adapted to survive, cooperated to thrive, and integrated because separation was neither practical nor desirable. You became invisible to history precisely because you became visible to your neighbours, accepted by your community, and successful in ways that don't leave obvious traces for future archaeologists to discover. But you understand now that mystery isn't always about what's unknown. Sometimes it's about what's unknowable from the outside, what can only be understood through lived experience rather than historical investigation. You've become part of a story that can't be solved like a puzzle because it was never broken in the first place. As you drift towards sleep, lulled by familiar sounds from a world that's become truly home, you find yourself hoping that somewhere, somehow, the people who wonder about your fate will eventually realise that the best possible ending to any story about lost colonists is that they were never really lost at all. They just found something better than what they were looking for.